Hello, this is Jeff Vanderstelt, Executive Director of Saturate and host of the Saturate podcast. Saturate exists to serve and equip leaders to start and strengthen unified gospel city movements that lead to gospel saturation, to the end that every man, woman, and child has repeated opportunities to meet Jesus through his church on mission everywhere and every day. Now, we believe in order for this to happen, we're going to have to step into the reality of what Jesus prayed for, that the church is united. He prayed in John 17 that we would all be one, that we'd experience this intimate relational connection to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and together we would be working as one body in a city, in a region, and collaborating around what we are calling the 5 key initiatives for Gospel City Movement. We find these 5 initiatives in the account that Luke gives of the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, as well as all their other fellow workers, when they would step into a city, when they would begin to be moved by the Holy Spirit to see an entire region reached. And so we see a pattern in Acts of this collaborative prayer together, where they're waiting on the Lord, they're seeking the Lord together, they're walking in dependency on the Spirit. And as they do that, then the Spirit leads them and guides them and shows them what to do and where to go. Then the next thing we see happen is Paul will, or whoever is sent, will preach the gospel. They'll definitely demonstrate it in tangible forms of service and care and love, but they're going to proclaim the gospel, making many disciples, Luke says. And so there's this commitment to praying together, to making disciples together, to then, as Luke records, Paul goes back and strengthens the church. So we're seeing strengthening of the believers, strengthening of the disciples. We're going to call that leader health, that we're not just committed to making disciples, but healthy ones that reproduce health. And in each one of those cases, they didn't just bring the good news of the kingdom in words, but in action, whether it was casting out demons, healing the sick, caring for the poor, welcoming the stranger. But they brought the real picture of the kingdom in tangible form. So you see this picture of serving the city in such a way that they taste the kingdom of God all around them. And then they would appoint elders and then move on and do that again. And so we see 5 key initiatives: prayer, disciple making, leader health, serving the city in a way that looks like the kingdom, and then starting new kingdom initiatives, establishing them, and then releasing them into leaders' hands and moving on and doing it again and again. So those are the 5 things when we go into a city that we help a city begin to strategize around. And oftentimes, some of those are already in place in a city. Sometimes they are just weak. Sometimes they don't exist at all. And so we help them begin to think through a holistic strategy around those 5. And what's great about those 5 is that they work at an individual level. I can personally pray, make disciples, get healthy, serve my neighbors, multiply what God's done in me into other people. We can do that at a church level. We can see churches do that, collective prayer, disciple making together, making sure everyone's growing up into maturity and health, serving the region our city is placed in, our church is placed in, and then hopefully starting new groups, raising up new leaders, starting new churches. And so these work at a collective level of a whole city, a church working on it on their own, and an individual in their own life. And what we find pretty consistently across the board, and we're doing this kind of work in Tokyo. We've been helping churches and city teams in the UK. We're doing it across the United States and Canada and in Mexico and other places. But what we find very consistently is the 2 areas of greatest weakness when it comes to a city strategy, a church strategy, or even an individual one, is that most would say we're weak at making disciples who make disciples, and we're weak at really ensuring emotional and spiritual health of our leaders and those who are overseeing ministries. And so that's where these days Saturate's spending a lot more of our time. I think there's some great ministries out there doing work in the space of prayer. I can point to so many great prayer movements, even in our own city here in Seattle. Pray Seattle is a wonderful thing. Pray Washington's another great thing. There's a whole bunch of great prayer initiatives. That area is not lacking in attention. Now, it's always needing focus, and we're never probably praying enough, but it's not like there's not something happening in that area. And also in the area of serving, most city initiatives that I interact with, they generally have some kind of a city need they're working on together. Here in Seattle, it's addressing homelessness. We've got even stuff like caring for our city in terms of removal of graffiti. We're trying to address some of the problems with education. We're trying to make sure there's a church connected or more to every school. There's a whole bunch of things like that that are really wonderful, and we got to keep doing more of that. And then we see a lot of church planting organizations getting started, and lots of denominations are committed to that. And we're seeing even more creative business startups. You've heard me in the past interview Hugh Halter and some of what they're doing with Brave Cities, and just trying to think of entrepreneurialism and as a way of bringing the kingdom of God to a city, bringing good to the places of a city where they need it. And so we're seeing a lot of that being addressed. But once again, we see the biggest needs across the board are around disciple making and leader health. And those are really connected, by the way, because the kinds of disciples you make are going to lead to the kinds of leaders that you raise up. And so if you're finding that you continually have emotionally unhealthy leaders, or you don't see sustainability or longevity in your leadership, it's likely it goes all the way back to the kinds of disciples you're making, because it starts similar to like when, raise up a child in the way he should go and he will not depart from it. Raise up a disciple in the way he should go and he will not depart from it. So the kinds of disciples you make are going to create the kinds of leaders you raise up, which are going to form the kinds of cultures that you embody. And those are cultures the ones that are going to either cultivate greater health or cultivate greater unhealth. And so those two are really connected. And so what we're going to do over the next several sessions together is we're going to look at developing a disciple-making pathway that pays attention to every step of the journey of spiritual formation, is hopefully really honest about the realities of what we're missing, what we need to give greater attention to, maybe steps that we're skipping along the way. And within it, we're going to talk about how this emotional health can be woven in to the entire process of your disciple-making strategy. So in the past, I would set up this podcast and say, hey, this week we're going to talk about one of the 5 initiatives. Well, for the next several sessions, we're going to try to talk about the 2 initiatives, disciple making and emotional health or leadership health, and especially how the pathway of how you make disciples is actually addressing both of those. And so I'm excited to have you join us on this journey. What I'd like you to do on a personal level, just pay attention as I take us through an overview of the pathway. Pay attention to maybe gaps in your own developmental process. And then if you're in any way giving leadership to something, whether it's a group you lead or a church you lead, a business, nonprofit, maybe just even your own household, ask yourself, what are the gaps we're missing? Do we have a pathway that's holistic? Do we have a disciple-making plan that raises up disciple-making disciples? Does it embody emotional, spiritual, relational health in how we do it? And so those are the things I want you to do, is kind of pay attention to what we're going to go through. Ask yourself, where am I at in this? Where are the gaps in my own life? And then if you're leading anything, pay attention to where the gaps might be in what you're leading. So I'm just going to start with a clarification here. We're going to talk about the disciple-making pathway. And I like using the language pathway because some people will talk about leadership pipelines, and then they'll then say a disciple-making pipeline. The problem with a pipeline is it's very linear. You just move along it, and you go from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And that just frankly is not how disciple making and discipleship actually works. It's more like a pathway up a mountain. You're on a trail. You sometimes feel like you go down to go up. Sometimes you feel like you go backwards to go forwards. There's sometimes many different ways to get up the mountain. Like you could choose one pathway over another. And so we want to recognize that the language of pathway probably makes a lot more sense because it's more like a journey. And not every journey is exactly the same, but eventually to get to the top, you're going to have to get through some of the same kinds of steps. And so we're going to talk about this as a pathway with a process, recognizing that it's not as linear as I'm going to even share. I know I'm going to make it sound linear, but it isn't nearly as linear as I'm going to lay it out. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm trying to at least talk about a process. And the language of spiritual parenting is going to be helpful for us as we think about a pathway. I will often say when you think about disciple making, it's better and more appropriate to think of it as spiritual parenting than it is just curriculum, teaching, structure, classrooms, all that kind of stuff. Because the reality is formation is more holistic and requires all of life. And so we want to think about it that way. And the language of family, household, parenting, child, all that is the language that we see in the New Testament over and over and over again. Now, some of you are thinking to yourself, yeah, but Jesus used the language of rabbi and student, and that's true, he did. When Jesus came into the context he did come in to a rabbinical culture where it was normative to have a rabbi call you to follow him and learn from him and then begin to emulate his ways. And so when you read the Gospels, you're going to see more of that language, of course. But the rest of the world didn't necessarily have a rabbinical culture as its norm. When Paul takes this command, this mission of God to make disciples of all the nations into a Greco-Roman context, or more Asian-informed world, or a Greek-Roman-informed context, he begins to shift the language. He uses the language of oikos, household. He talks about spiritual parents, fathers, mothers. He'll refer to people as still infants or children in the faith. John will do the same thing when he writes his letter. I write to you, little children, young men, older men. So he's using these stages of formation in the way he addresses the people of God. And the reason for this just made a lot more sense. Like if you went into a context where they don't have a norm that you would leave your household and join a rabbi for several years, when that's not the norm, then using that kind of language is going to be confusing or challenging. And I think I sometimes think that's what's happened even in the Western context that we live in, that when we use the language of rabbi or disciple, which is still like, let's not lose it. It's in the Bible. It's what Jesus did. But it can, for some people, feel like, well, that's for very special people who can get into a monastic way of living, or who can leave their job for so many years, or those are people, quote unquote, called into missions or to ministry. And so we've got this category of people who are like, yeah, I can leave everything and do that, but the majority of the people can't. So therefore, the majority of the people aren't going to become disciples who make disciples, because that's only for people who can follow their rabbi for 3 years, like Jesus' first disciples. And I think that's where it gets us in trouble. Instead of saying like, no, everybody has to experience a spiritual birth. They have to go from spiritually dead to spiritually alive and become a spiritual baby in the faith. And then we know what to do with babies. Like you've talked to most anybody who, even if they haven't had a baby, if they're not a parent, they were a baby. So they know what happened, and they were part of a household where they watched another one be a baby, be born into the family and be taken care of. And so that language, and I think this is why Paul uses it, it's just intuitive. And it's easy to get your head around in terms of like, well, what do we do with a baby? What do we do with a child? What do we do with a young adult? What do we do when you become an adult and when you become a parent yourself? And so Paul shifts to that language. We're going to shift to that language. And we have in the disciple-making labs that we created. I just pause a moment and just, some of you heard about this before, but I've been helping churches in a variety of form for over 30 years now. And over time, we just began to learn that it takes a lot longer than just like an hour training or a day-long training to help churches and church leaders shift the paradigm and rebuild culture and design what we now call a pathway. And so we began to implement our disciple making lab, which leads churches and leaders through a 10-month process of redefining, or at least clarifying, their definition of a disciple, clarifying what the present culture is like for making disciples, assessing whether it's effective, paying attention whether we actually have a pathway, and then helping to redesign, if needed, a better pathway for making disciples. So we've been doing that for, I guess it's about 4 years now, 3 or 4 years. And we've helped almost 40 churches now redesign their pathway. We're hearing incredible feedback, just great results. And like I said, we're doing this in a variety of places around the world. Just got back from Tokyo a few weeks ago, where we kicked off our second round of a disciple-making lab there with 11 churches. So we're just really encouraged by the results we're seeing. And we want to make sure it's available. We're eventually going to be making it in forms that don't require you necessarily to come be in person like the present version of it does, though I think that's the best way to do it. We're going to be providing some online ways to do it, that you could take your team through with videos, and just a process that we're building for you. But in it, we've discovered that a lot of churches don't have a clear pathway. They don't have a clear process. Their people of the church certainly don't know it, and wouldn't know how to engage it or implement it or join in at the part they're in appropriate ways. And so what I want to do is in this session and this time together, just do a bigger, broader overview of a pathway of being a disciple-making culture, creating disciple-making disciples. And then each subsequent episode, I'm going to unpack each stage in greater detail, and even begin to unpack some of the practices and behaviors and spaces in which we can help people experience formation. So for the next probably 15 or so minutes, I'm just going to give you the overview of what a pathway can look like, and just frame it up in a way that hopefully gives you some holders or containers to think about your own context, your own process, your own pathway in your own life. So, of course, we start, according to Ephesians, knowing that people are spiritually dead. Paul makes it really clear that we all once were dead in our trespasses and sins, that we walked in the way of the world just like everyone else. And he's speaking to people who are no longer spiritually dead, but they were. And so that's what we're dealing with when we begin. And that doesn't mean people don't have a spiritual life. Don't hear it that way. But they're not spiritually alive to Christ. They're not connected to the head, Christ, who is head of the church. They don't have access in a deeply intimate, emotional, relational way with God the Father, because they've yet to come to Christ the Son. And Jesus said, it's only through me that you come to the Father, ultimately. So there are people who are spiritually dead, and we want to, as people who know Jesus, who are spiritually alive, we want to be really wise and kind and careful about how we love people who don't yet have an awareness or a connection to Jesus and to the Father through Jesus, and therefore not having the fullness of the Spirit of God in them at work, changing them from the inside out. So the first thing I say here is we've got to train the church how to be hospitable. And I'm going to spend a lot more time on that when I unpack this particular stage. But the real quick way to think about that is hospitality is making a safe space for the outsider or stranger to feel at home without needing to change anything. So they don't have to change their behaviors, their beliefs, their language in order to feel at home with us. So do we know how to create the safe place for the stranger to feel at home with us? And in that space, they're able to be known, and we're able to get to know their story and their pain and their longings and their hurts in such a way that we can actually care for them in a very relational and real way, meeting their real needs, with the hope that over time they would inquire as to why we would do what we're doing. And that's when we're prepared to then share the good news of Jesus with the hope that they would receive, experience new birth through the Spirit, and then be born again and are enter the next part of the spiritual journey, which is they would become a spiritual infant. Now, some people call that first stage not spiritually dead. They like to call it spiritual unborn. They aren't yet born again, but we're leading them to that. So it feels a little bit more like pregnancy. That's something that God is already at work doing something in them, and we're just joining the work that God's doing to bring them to that place where we get to see that new birth. And in that sense, we're like a midwife. We're not really the one who created it or did it. It's God who did it, but we're there as part of the process. And then as they come to faith, as they become born again, as they wake up spiritually to this new reality of this relationship with God that they have now in Christ, now they become spiritual babies. And what do we do with babies? We give them a name. That's their new identity. We do that in people's baptism. So we establish them in this new identity. We help them begin to use their voice. What do we want a little baby to do? Start crying. When a baby cries, it makes its needs known. Attentive and attuned parents hear the cry, pay attention to it, experience real emotional and relational attachment as they attune with their child around their needs and then make sure those needs are being met. We want every new Christian to know that they can do that with God, and they can do that with their new brothers and sisters in this family, where they can cry out loud. They can say out loud what's going on inside of them, which is really just, and in some ways, making up their own psalm, singing their own song to God of pain, of trial, of longing, of celebration, whatever it may be. But we want to help them use their voice. And then as they're using their voice, we want them to receive from God the feeding they need, whether that's the word of God, the encouragement of brothers and sisters, the exhortation of others. But just like with a little baby, you don't expect them to feed themselves spiritually. They're being fed by others. So we want to do that at this stage, make sure they're getting fed, being established in their identity, surrounded by community, in a safe environment for nurture and care to be taking place. And over time, that little baby's going to grow up into a spiritual child. And what do we do with children when they start to give words to their cry, when they start to have logic applied to their feelings, when they start to begin to acknowledge and can make their voice heard and start to, say stuff like me, my, and, they start to try to figure out their world and everybody else's world. Well, what do we start to do at that point? We start to teach them how to love one another, how to, treat your brothers and sisters in a way that you'd want to be treated, how to obey your mom and dad, how to start to live into the household expectations that we as a family engage in. And that's what we do as people spiritually too. We say, we want to help you learn how to love one another and practice all the one another's. Bear with one another, forgive one another, pray for one another, serve one another. There's, anywhere between, somewhere in the 30 or more one another commands that were given by Jesus, as well as through the epistles, of how we're supposed to show love tangibly to brothers and sisters, as well as to our enemies and those who are not yet in the family of God. So this is where we're practicing the one another's. We're practicing the commandments. Like, what do you do with your little children? When they move from being a baby to a child, we now teach them to obey mom and dad. Well, Jesus taught us to obey all that he commanded. And when we make new disciples, we're teaching them to obey all that he commanded. So we're teaching them the one another's, creating a space for them to practice them. We're teaching them the commands, creating spaces for them to practice them. And then we're teaching them to be self-feeders, where they now know how to read the word and take it in and be fed by it. They know how to pray and make their needs known to God. They know how to engage in silence and solitude so they can learn how to be present with what's going on in their heart and bring that before the Lord. They know how to do fasting and feasting. They're beginning to engage in all the practices. And this is what we teach children to do. So eventually, they can start to help feed others. And that's when we start to move towards being a spiritual young adult or an adolescent. It's where now they can help those who are behind them start to grow up. Children can help infants. Young adults can help children and infants, and as well as helping people who are far from God come to know God. And these at the adolescent stage, you might want to think about this as like an apprenticeship stage or a getting ready to go stage, right? It's like, what do you do with your teenagers? when I was a youth pastor, I would regularly tell parents, your job is to help them make as many adult decisions under your care with the freedom and safety to fail under your nurturing governance, so that when they're on their own, they've already been taught how to make good decisions and they don't blow up their lives because they're all on their own when they make the bad decision. So when we're teenagers, when we have adolescents in the faith, we want to give them as many opportunities to practice spiritually leading others, to practice the kinds of behaviors they're going to do on their own, not isolated from community, but where they're starting to give leadership to those younger than them in the faith. And so this should be the space where they're being mentored intentionally. They're giving ministry opportunities, as many as possible, to practice and learn and celebrate failure, because failure is the way to growth and development. It's where we start to share, if you're a spiritual adult or grandparent, you share some of your authority with them, giving them opportunity to do the things that you get to do, but you do that with them. You're going to want to prepare them for the reality that there's going to be a real spiritual battle. Now, you need to do that as young as possible, make them aware we're walking into a spiritual reality with spiritual enemies, but especially by the time they're an adolescent, a teenager in the faith, they need to be getting ready for the spiritual battle that's going to come when they start stepping into the space of being a spiritual parent, where they're leading others in the faith. And so think of this as the apprenticeship stage. When we work with most churches around their pathway, this tends to be the biggest gap. In fact, when I hear leaders say, like the church planning pipeline is dried up, or we just don't have we have too few leaders for the needs that are around us, it's usually a problem with their pathway, that they didn't build this particular part of the stage for spiritual adolescents to experience apprenticeship into ministry, to be prepared to go and lead a ministry themselves. So again, we'll unpack this a lot more in the future episodes. The next stage is spiritual parenting. At this point, someone's mature enough to do everything I've just said, to lead others through the process. They can lead the pathway themselves up to spiritual parent. They know how to create environments for spiritual formation. For each stage that I just described, they can teach others the commands. They can teach others the one another's. They can train others in spiritual warfare. They can create cultures where feeding takes place. Many cases, these are people who are probably going to be leading a small group, a missional community, a ministry in the city, an expression of the kingdom in a unique way in your context, in your city, possibly even leading a church plant, a new start, or being a part of a church planting team. So these people are at that stage. They're ready to go. They can discern in prayer, what is God saying? Where is he sending? Who is he calling us to reach? And they can actually form a core around that. They can help others join the team. And in a sense, they can help create a spiritual family to begin to lead this new ministry forward. So a lot of churches have people, by the way, in the position of spiritual parent without the training that was necessary to actually do the work of being a spiritual parent, which is why I think we see so little healthy multiplication, why we see so many gaps in the pathway, why a lot of leaders burn out, are overwhelmed, because they weren't prepared well. And so they're operating kind of like a teen parent. They weren't prepared to be a parent, but they are one. They're at least in the position of one. And so we want to do a better job of making sure we're preparing people well for that stage. And you might even be one of those people who go like, I don't think I've been developed in a lot of things you just described. In fact, usually when we bring people through the pathway, even some of the pastors or staff members of churches will say, I feel like a whole lot was missed in my process because I never had anybody disciple me in this way. And that's okay. That's fairly normative for a lot of people. It's not okay if we just leave it that way, but it's okay to discover that. And it's okay to then say, let's find out what we're going to do about that, which is what the next several episodes will probably be really helpful for you on. And then the last stage is the spiritual grandparent. And that's somebody who raises up parents, who coaches parents, spiritual parents, who can oversee environments where it's normative to equip people all the way through to the parent stage. And just like a grandparent, they're probably not doing all the parenting anymore, but they're pouring into a lot of people who are parenting, and they're great support and encouragement to those who are. And my hope would be that this would, over time, this would be what a typical elder or overseer of a church or a region or a ministry would be operating as, so that they would have multiple generations that they can point to of disciples who've made disciples, who've made disciples, who've made disciples. So over the next several episodes, we're going to unpack in greater detail each stage. But for the meantime, I'd just love for you to take a moment and just think, okay, what stages am I familiar with? Which ones seem a little foreign? What was I missing in my own process? What am I missing in the process I'm leading? And what do we need to think about in terms of how we address the gaps and the places that might have been overlooked in our own process, as well as in the process that we're leading others in? And so look forward to taking you through this journey. Just as a close, I want to let you know, we discovered over time as we would take churches through this disciple-making pathway that one of the things that many of them asked about was if there was any kind of assessment created to help people understand where they're at in the pathway. And so we created a Disciples Pathfinder. You can actually go to saturatetheworld.com and find it on our drop-down menu. It's basically a way to discern where you're at on your own journey. Are you still a spiritual infant, a spiritual child, a spiritual young adult? And then what would be some good steps you could take to begin to move forward in your own journey? We have a guided process, even if you want it, to help you take next steps along the way. It's also set up in a way that leaders, you could have those under your care go through the Pathfinder and then acknowledge they want their results sent to you, so you could gain insight as to where all of your people in your church are at. Eventually, we're going to create a tool that's going to even help you give a visual to show you exactly where everyone's at in your church, and begin to help you begin a plan or build a plan that would help move people forward in their own journey on the pathway you're designing. So I just encourage you, go to our website, saturatetheworld.com, check out resources. Right underneath that, you'll find the Disciples Pathfinder. We would love for you to take that. And by the way, if you do, please don't hesitate to give us feedback. It's still only a month or so into its release, and we're tweaking it. We're working on it. We want to make it better, but we want to do everything we can to help you. So I hope this served you well. Please check it out and stay tuned for our next episode.